Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us in this webinar series that BirdLife has launched to talk about how can we all together push for a green recovery. I am incredibly grateful to all of our panelists today. Allow me to just do a quick introduction of why are we doing all of this, and then I'll let the speakers share their points of view, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. As Sean said, you can use the Q&A board to help us see your questions, and we'll address them as much as we can during the discussion session. Okay, so first of all, allow me to thank all of you guys who have signed our petition to make the right to a healthy natural environment a human right. As you may know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights doesn't have a right to a healthy natural environment. And this is one of the pleas that we have. So we have had over 60,000 signatures in the relaunch of the campaign over the last week. So thank you so much to all of you who have joined. For us, having a human right, the right to a healthy planet as a human right is kind of the umbrella that covers everything. And we are very interested in making sure that we can have, out of the difficulties and challenges that we have been living through this COVID pandemic, a green recovery, an opportunity to really bounce forward and build much better than what we have done so far. I know that many of you may be new to BirdLife, so let me quickly introduce who we are. We are a family of over 100 organizations working around the world, all united by the common vision and mission to conserve not just birds, but all nature, and use birds as the ambassadors of nature. We are truly the power of many. We're the largest family of national conservation organizations in the planet. We connect the world by using birds that are connecting us to each other and helping us and understand that in order for us to conserve our planet, we have to work beyond borders and beyond cultural and political differences. And we are the global authority for birds. Our science helps us concentrate in the most threatening species and the most important places for birds in nature. And that is one of the best strategies, because birds are truly the canary in the coal mine. They do tell us what's happening with the rest of the world. So very quickly, why are we doing this? We are living the impact of this terrible pandemic, and many of you may be not very happy to hear about this one more time. So we have been living the impact of the COVID crisis, over 16.5 million cases as of the 28th of July, which is incredible. And I just saw news from Japan that they have closed borders again, and Australia has seen the highest daily number of cases again. So 650,000 deaths worldwide, 213 countries and territories affected. But the problem of this is not only the tragic loss to lives and the huge strain on the health system, but the impact on the economy. 400 million full-time jobs lost in the second quarter of 2020, reported by the ILO. 18.3% of that in the Americas. Lower and middle income countries hit the hardest. 14 million jobs in the US by the end of 14 million jobs lost in the US by the end of 2020, May 2020, reported by Pew. 835,000 jobs in Australia, 600,000 jobs in the UK at risk. Forbes is saying that 42% of those job losses may be permanent, and 1.6 billion workers in the informal economy at risk of losing their livelihoods. Projected deficits could reach 30 trillion, according to McKinsey, and the global economy to shrink between 5.3 or 5.5%, but it will push 60 million into extreme poverty, according to the World Bank. So there's no question that is the worst crisis in peacetime. So the priorities are clear. We know that we need to reignite the economy, restore purchasing power, and create new jobs, and prioritize definitely the least well off. But what we are after is making sure that that happens in a way that simultaneously tackles the climate change and biodiversity loss crisis. It is by no doubt the worst global catastrophe since World War II, but we feel at BirdLife that we have a unique opportunity to reset our relationship with the planet and put nature at the heart of a new, fair, and more sustainable development model. So we started these conversations on the 1st of July. We brought together leaders of the multilateral world. Then we elevated the discussion at the high-level political forum of the United Nations. And now we're having leaders from the business world. We will have another session in August with leaders from the youth movement, and hopefully that will tee us up to a big event at the Biodiversity Summit that the UN is organizing in September. What are we learning so far? And very quickly, since I took so much time. We are setting ambitious, we're learning from the webinars that we have had so far that setting ambitious targets is incredibly important. And we have heard from the European Green Deal, the biodiversity strategy, the farm to fork strategy in Europe. But we heard from many of our panelists in the last two webinars that implementing and wrapping up the current agreement, so the NDCs for climate and the MBSAPs for biodiversity, is going to be incredibly important so we can have a really clear target. Now, the other thing is that the message that came loud and clear from both Carlos Manuel and Inger is that there are very strong, we have to be very bold repurposing harmful subsidies. There's over $500 billion a year invested on harmful subsidies, harmful to biodiversity, when we're only investing 82 billion on nature of the 140 billion needed, and for 546 billion on climate investments of the 1.6 trillion that is needed, acknowledging that 80% of that investment is on transport and energy, when nature-based solutions that could be more than 30% of the solution have only less than 2% of the investment. And that there's a need to defund activities that drive deforestation and biodiversity loss. Carlos Manuel was saying that we fund 142 times more activities that destroy nature than what we are investing in nature. In addition to this, huge opportunity for multi-stakeholder cooperation, the possibility of creating green jobs that generate greater rates of return, not only economic value, but also climate, nature, and human well-being benefits, and greater opportunities for public-private partnerships. And this is where I'm stealing your line, André, looking at hybrid models that are in combining the innovation that private sector comes in with the policies and measures that the governments need to put in place. And in addition to this, and my computer doesn't freeze again, we know that the 2008 crisis showed us that when we put the stimulus to green jobs and green work, we create more jobs, we create higher shorter-term returns per dollar invested, increase long-term savings, and create lasting environmental. So we know that there are initial positive signs. We have seen New Zealand already putting 10% of, almost 10% of their stimulus package to fund nature and to redeploy people to work in conservation. We have seen the ambition of the European Union with the biodiversity strategy, and I'm not going to dwell too much on this right now so we can save some of the time that I lost. And we know that it is urgent and necessary. We just heard this weekend from Andrew Dobson's and others, Stuart Pym and others, paper that the cost of preventing further pandemics over the next decade just by protecting wildlife and forests, we're not talking even about oceans or anything else, just by protecting wildlife and forests would equate to just 2% of the estimated financial damage caused by the COVID pandemic. 50% of the global GDP is potentially at risk as a result of the dependence on business and nature, reported by the WEF in July. 165 billion in worldwide economic stress and damage from natural disasters was reported in 2018, and 50% of that was uninsured. The World Bank Global Report was saying that we need policies to rebuild both in the short and long term, and will entail strengthening health services and putting in place targeted stimulus measures to help reignite growth, including support for the private sector. but half of the Fortune 500 companies mention biodiversity in their sustainability reports, and only 5 set specific, measurable, and time-bound targets. Now we see the market reacting, and this is taken from the Financial Times. I know that there was someone from the Financial Times sign on, so thanks so much for joining us. But thanks so much for reporting on this. The first 4 months of 2020, the S&P 500 ESG index beat the normal S&P index by 0.6%. BlackRock reported that 88% of their globally representative selection of sustainable indices outperformed their non-sustainable peers. And the first quarter of 2020 flows into global sustainable open-ended funds were 41% higher year on year. So we are seeing the market reacting. And today or yesterday, the Financial Times had a report on the investors who are looking at ESG really starting to understand that the E is not climate only, that it has to be biodiversity as well and ecosystem health. So that's precisely why we have this stellar panel. And this is why we're having this conversation today. I am incredibly grateful and happy to introduce Kathleen McLaughlin, Executive Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer of Walmart, André Hoffmann, Vice Chair of Roche and Holding and President of the Fondation MAVA, and Nicole Schwab, Co-Director of the Platform to Accelerate Nature-Based Solutions in the World Economic Forum, and Piyush Gupta, Chief Executive Officer and Director of the DBS Group in Singapore, and also a member of the advisory group of BirdLife. So without further ado, and with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen and give the floor to Piyush. So Piyush, can you tell us more from the financial sector? How do you see a green recovery happening?
All right. So thanks, Patricia. It's really good to be on this call. I won't belabor the points you made about, it sounds like almost churlish to say that there are some silver linings in the pandemic, but there are. And that is what you called this notable shift. I think there's a momentum for action. In addition to some of the things you mentioned, one, I think there's increasingly a recognition because of the pandemic that tail risks happen. By and large, we've been trying to push the tail risks on the back burner, but the pandemic tells you that they occur, and there's a greater degree of consciousness and desire, I think, among the public sector and civil society to recognize that this is something we can't ignore entirely. The second is, I think, in a perverse kind of way, it's quite as pointed out that we as humanity and civilizations can take a lot of short-term pain. This time we had a gun to our head. We didn't have a choice. We had to get locked in. There could be tons of job losses. But the truth is that you can be forced to take a lot of short-term pain for good long-term consequences. And I think so that's in a perverse way, a second positive. The third, as you correctly pointed out, money can be found. Nobody would have imagined that in 4 short months, there would be like $12, $13 trillion of fiscal and monetary support in a world which was already massively over-leveraged. But when push came to shove, we were able to find large sums of money. And the fourth, I think there's increasingly the recognition that the biggest challenge coming out of this is going to be jobs. And there's no other better place to find jobs than in the green recovery. I mean, the data points from 08-09 you pointed out are quite clear. Other research also suggests that $1 million invested in renewables, for example, creates 6-7 times more jobs than those invested in fossils. So I think there's a lot of reason for us to be able to catalyze action. Now, we did some work at DBS, and it's quite clear that what you said again, you made this point, large sums of money are needed. For the time being, a largest amount of that comes from the public sector. Going forward, you're going to have to see the private sector play a much bigger role. One of the challenges to what I said, we found a lot of money has been this. If you look at the nature of most of the fiscal spend in the last 3-4 months, it's all gone for consumption activity. For every example you cite about New Zealand's $1 billion, the truth is trillions of dollars have gone to put money into people's pockets so that they can, maintain their lives and livelihood kind of question. Money has gone to SMEs just to protect jobs. So the bulk of the money, 99% of it, is going to saving people, keeping lives going on consumption expenditure. None of this money spent will actually wind up being of an investment nature or money that can actually be developmental in terms of economic growth. And because this amount of money being spent is going to create so much fiscal debt burden and fiscal stress, I think public sector's capacity to keep anteing up more is going to be somewhat limited. So it's good that, you know, the European Green Deal and New Zealand, etc., are doing stuff. But to my mind, the big question is going to be how do we rope in the private sector and private investment at scale as we go forward. To my mind, there are 5 things I've put down. There'll be a lot more, but I thought of 5 that I think are going to be really important as we go forward. And the first of these I just call getting the taxonomy and mandatory disclosures, taxonomy right, and making a regime of mandatory disclosures. So to that extent, I'm sort of aligned with what you're talking about, André. There needs to be a public policy element to driving much of what we want to do. Today, the taxonomy is very broken. There is no clear definitions of what is green, what is light green, what is brown. There is some more work on the climate side than on the biodiversity and nature side. But certainly the requirement for mandatory disclosures is limited. I was encouraged with the European package recently, which is trying to make it mandatory to put a sustainability disclosure and stuff. But I think that's a big agenda that needs to be fulfilled. Second, I think we need to improve dramatically data collection and measurements. Today, even if you have requirements, in some cases people have requirements, the outcomes are all over the place. And partly we're not leveraging technology. Today, technology should be able to let you measure a bunch of things that we could never measure before, between sensors and GPS and so on and so forth. But we need to be able to do that at scale. Third, we really have got to focus a lot on getting the accounting right. And I'm a big believer in this. This is one of our biggest challenges. Our gap-based system of accounting and capture of value is just unidimensional. It does not capture impact. It does not capture externalities, either positive or negative. And this, for certainly in my industry, is very challenging. Therefore, measuring risk, we do not measure the kind of risk because we don't know how to take, you know, whether biodiversity related risk or climate related risk into account. Now, some of the work, TCFD and so on, is trying to drive us there. But fundamentally, we need to agree on a new system of value recognition and a new way of capturing the accounting. Fourth, to really bring in the private sector, you have to make it a market-driven process. So you have to create the marketplaces for positive impact, and whether the marketplaces to trade carbon or a whole bunch of other things, we have to try and do that. And finally, we've got to leverage the technologies that continue to create new opportunities across the board. And frankly, at the end of the day, private sector will come in if there's an opportunity for getting the economics right. And so we just got to continue to see how we do that. Now, at DBS, actually, some of the things we're doing to try and move this from abstract to real. I'm not trying to suggest that we've got it all right, but just to give a sense to the audience that I think you can move the needle in real ways. Just earlier this year, for example, we published a transition finance taxonomy. I think we're the first bank in the world to do that, which is really trying to think about recognizing the need for a just transition. You can't move from brown to green across the board overnight. You can't stop, financing ships, aircraft, buildings, steel, everything. I mean, the world will collapse. So how do we actually have a way of trying to get the taxonomy right and figuring a path to financing in a transition sense? We've been one of the first contributors to the climate-related financial disclosures, which essentially try to figure what is the climate-related risk. But we're just starting and launching a new task force, which we're one of the 10 founder members of, which is a task force on nature-related financial disclosures. Now, this is going to be far more complex than climate because no standards exist for what you need to capture on trying to figure species loss or biodiversity loss and how you're going to capture it and report it. So I think even the task force work is just starting. I think it'll take us a few years to get it right. But if you don't get this taxonomy and the disclosure regime right, you won't focus people's minds on the issue. On the data collection, we're doing a couple of different things. One, we're trying to work on projects using satellite technology, working with Google Earth actually, to see if you can track mangrove plantations and the growth of trees, just to make sure that we can capture what is the amount of carbon sequestration that is being achieved. We're also launching and experimenting a blockchain solution, which is actually on the other end, to make sure that if there is money being provided, like it goes to the actual beneficiaries of the projects. The money is actually tracked back to the societies and the people who need to benefit from the money. So that's again different ways of trying to do the measurement, right? We did a couple of studies which we published earlier this year on impact measurement. We chose palm oil and the automotive sector. And we tried to do a holistic 360-degree, both the positive externalities, the job effects, education, as well as the negative externalities. I'll be the first to confess that it is very hard, and you could probably drill a lot of holes into what we've done, which is why I say that we need to get a broader consensus about how we're going to do this, except, we've tried to do it at least to put some thing on the table. We're trying to develop a couple of marketplaces. One, we're an investor and trying to develop a sustainable natural rubber marketplace to track the provenance and authenticity of rubber right from the farm all the way to the tire companies. And we're currently exploring doing something which is a carbon marketplace, both a bilateral marketplace and an exchange. And finally, we're doing a bunch of stuff. Last year, we did about $5 billion of sustainable financing. A lot of it, to your point, Patricia, was in the renewable energy space. Much less of it was in the nature-based space, though we are now beginning to do something with the food system and trying to do something on the agri side. So I think the point I'm making is that some of these things are doable, but they require a massive public policy agenda. They require a lot of civil society driven impetus for the private sector to be able to respond meaningfully. My last thing, I don't have a slide. So in Singapore, we have something called the Emerging Stronger Task Force. We're collectively working on seeing how Singapore emerges from the COVID stronger for the future. Of the 7 or 8 themes, one of the themes which has emerged, which I'm privileged to be driving, is the one on sustainability. And within that theme, we're trying to see how we can actually build back greener or build forward greener in Singapore. But that 2 elements of that are public sector driven. So it is getting a policy framework right. And the policy framework includes a whole range of issues around carbon related policies, cap and trade policies, biodiversity policies. But that's a joint effort, public sector driven, we're participating. The second is an effort really to try and make sure Singapore is a home to a lot of the appropriate agencies, measurement agencies, validation agencies, marketplace agencies. So see if we can cite them in Singapore. And then the 3 efforts which are private sector driven. So one of them is to actually create a validation and ratings agency for carbon measurement. Second is to try and create a marketplace, a carbon marketplace in Singapore. And the last is really what I think finally is most important. We're trying to see how do we create a more carbon conscious society, which is by creating carbon calculators for SMEs and for public at large, and creating appropriate offset solutions. And because the bulk of the offset solutions, again to your point, Patricia, 30% plus are really in the nature space. Most of the nature-based solutions are in our backyard. They're in Indonesia, they're in Vietnam, they're in India. So we're actively trying to see how we can work with some of these providers of nature-based solutions to provide offsets for consumers and for SMEs to be able to actually do something more than just calculate their carbon. So perhaps I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions later in the Q&A session.
Thanks so much, Piyush. A lot of the great stuff that you mentioned, and one of the most exciting ones, the Task Force on Nature related financial disclosure that was also reported yesterday in one of the pieces of the Financial Times on ESG. So with that in mind and thinking about measurement and thinking about tracking, let me switch gears and give the floor to Kathleen. Kathleen, you guys at Walmart have been launching a very interesting project Gigaton to try to figure out how to trace your supply chain and how to make sure that that is compliant with your carbon policy and carbon targets. How do you see that coming as part of the green recovery, and how do you see your Walmart and your suppliers being part of the push for a green recovery?
Well, thank you, Patricia. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for having me, and hello, everybody. Yeah, as you've laid out so eloquently and Piyush reinforced, nature is rising in awareness across all sectors in importance, and I'd say these days at the level of climate, in the sense of urgency to address through government, through business, through civil society. And it's for the reasons that you laid out. You know, we've been working with World Wildlife and they've underscored that about 60% of nature has been lost in the last 40 years. It's just measured in terms of loss of animals on this planet. So if you consider business, you know, obviously not only is nature critical for all life on planet, but if you want to look through a really parochial lens, much of our GDP is at risk. I think you said 50% according to the World Economic Forum. That's something we've seen as well. And for a company like Walmart that sells products that people use every day, you know, food and apparel and so on, so many of these things depend on nature for their ingredients. So if you want just to take a very parochial business lens to it, you know, it's critical just for that reason. So certainly the pandemic has compromised anyone's ability to really deal with this other crisis that has not abated while we've been dealing with the pandemic. It's getting worse and worse. Yet, as Piyush noted, it does provide an opportunity perhaps to reset, and it will require fundamental transformation of our systems. This won't just be about taking the money set aside for recovery and then putting it right back into the way we've always done things and get that going again the same way. It's going to have to be invested and there'll have to be a lot of creative problem-solving energy brought to bear in business to rewire the approaches that we use. And in retail and consumer products, that means how do we produce products? How do we transport them? How do they get consumed? What happens at the end of life? And that's certainly how we've been trying to approach it at Walmart as we've been working on sustainability for a number of years. So I do think in terms of the mindset of people globally, there is also a real opportunity to accelerate action. Because as we've been dealing with this pandemic, each of us everywhere in the world has now had this experience of the need for collective action and the difference we can make through individual action. When you add it all up, it turns into a movement. So the same way we've been working to flatten the curve on the pandemic, we need to flatten the curve on emissions. We actually need to set it down. We need to flatten the curve on the loss of nature. And so our hope is that this experience has actually awakened in people a broader consciousness about not only the need to respond to a crisis, but how to do it, and that it is possible. I agree with Piyush. Market-based solutions will be really important. I think another thing the pandemic has taught us is that you can't separate economic, social, and environmental health. These things are highly intertwined. And so for us to have sustainable solutions for nature, we have to take care of the people in terms of equity and in terms of prosperity. So we need solutions that integrate the economy and social justice and environment. And so I think one of the exciting things, maybe it's a bit of good news, is that in much of the business community, this isn't a new idea. And certainly in consumer products and in retail, people have been working in a way on transforming methods of production and so on for a number of years now. Piyush, as you were saying, the focus has been largely on climate, but now as people are starting to realize the importance of nature, we're starting to use the platforms and the tools that we developed really to get after emissions for nature. So Patricia, you asked about Project Gigaton, you know, that's one of them. And for Walmart as a retailer, for any retailer, we can play a special role in this sector because we engage such a large number of suppliers across so many product types. So even though we don't necessarily directly source back to farm, we certainly work with a lot of suppliers who do. And that's really why we launched Project Gigaton. So for those of you who aren't familiar with that, this is a program, a platform that we launched 3 years ago to engage our supplier base in accelerating action on emissions. We now have 2,300 suppliers working on emissions reduction across all categories, produce to seafood to apparel, you name it. And the way it works is we've invited our suppliers to set targets around emissions reduction. We've provided information and tools to help them accelerate action in energy, agriculture, forests, product design, waste management, packaging. So in each of these arenas, we've helped link our suppliers to the specific ideas and practices they could adopt and how to translate those into emissions reduction, to resources in civil society. Many organizations such as World Wildlife Conservation International, Nature Conservancy, Environmental Defense Fund, CDP, World Resources Institute have helped us create this platform and set of tools. And then we've been recording what the suppliers are actually delivering in terms of emissions avoidance. And we're now at about 230 million metric tons emissions avoided on the way to our goal of a gigaton. So what's interesting about that platform is it already has embedded in it programs around forests and programs around agriculture. And as was mentioned earlier, nature is about 1/3 of the solution for climate. Well, guess what? The very same actions that we need to do in nature to restore the climate can also produce benefits for biodiversity, for soil health, and so on. So in business, we're using practical platforms like this, where we believe there's a business case and we can encourage our suppliers to participate, to now broaden the set of goals they're going after, and through the same actions and doing a bit more, actually go after nature. So we have a provocative idea, which is, what if the production and consumption of food and other products was actually helping to regenerate nature? And that's the question we're trying to answer. How could you actually rewire the way we produce everything so that you'd be regenerating nature? So a few specific things, and then I'll hand it back to you, Patricia, that we're trying to do as part of this. So one, certifications. This is sort of the bare, bones initial approach most people take, which is there are some good certifications out there that are a start. So transitioning all of our private brand tuna to MSC certified, RSPO plus certification, all these sorts of things are a way to start to have a sense of practices at source for certain commodities. The second, though, and that starts to get more exciting, is engaging suppliers in practical actions to change the methods of production. So the Gigaton platform is a way that we use to help us do that. And we're starting to see some very exciting examples of innovative approaches to sourcing. One example I would give is what people are calling a jurisdiction approach, which is a form of public-private partnership. So you go back to source, for example, palm oil in Malaysia, in Sabah, and if you can get the private sector connected to government and civil society and work together in a place to optimize it holistically for conservation, regeneration, better yields, and management of the part of the land that is in production, you can get increased benefit for the economy, for people, and for the environment. Unilever has been doing some interesting work in this space with palm oil in that region, and that's just one example. Another example would be Midwest Row Crop Collaborative that we formed a few years ago in the Midwest of the United States to get after row crops and the methods of production there to enhance soil health, mitigate and limit nutrient runoff into fresh waterways and so on. And that is a collective approach with multiple suppliers such as Kellogg's, General Mills and so on, and many conservation organizations to work with farmers to help accelerate transition to better agricultural practices. There's a group called One Planet Business for Biodiversity that Danone, Emmanuel Faber from Danone started, and it is now its own independent thing. There are about 30 companies heavily engaged there in exchanging best practices for regenerative agriculture, for forest management, commodity sourcing, and so on, with a goal to have a whole pipeline of exciting public-private partnerships in sourcing, in supply chains to rewire the way commodity production happens. So we're part of that. We're very excited to be with that group because we think it's building a like-minded coalition across the broader sector. A third thing that we're doing is around transparency and measurement tools. So we've made a number of investments, particularly through our philanthropic arm, in tools such as Global Forest Watch, Map Biomass, Global Fisheries Watch, vessel monitoring systems, different approaches to measure and monitor practices back to source that are relevant for nature, also relevant for human rights. So we're pretty excited about the opportunity that technology now provides us. Someone mentioned Google Earth. Microsoft is also investing in something they're calling the planetary computer. This opportunity to use data in a much more impactful way is a big one. We're going to need it. We need that development to happen and get integrated into business practices. Fourth thing is innovative finance. There are a number of groups that have emerged to put capital into restoring nature. One I'll highlight is NatureVest, part of Nature Conservancy. I happen to be on their advisory board. It's pretty exciting. Programs like Blue Bonds, other programs where they can take at scale large landscapes and work with governments and investors to not only restore nature and conserve nature, but do it in a way that creates an economic benefit for local people. And then finally, last one, of course, is conservation. And even a company like Walmart can work in conservation. We've been working for a number of years in a program called Acres for America. It started out as a simple offset program for offsetting the real estate required for our stores. We've got about 5,000 stores in the United States. Each one takes up a chunk of land. There's a parking lot, so we started this to say, well, let's just offset whatever we're using and conserve it in high value landscapes. So we've been working with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. That program has grown and grown. It's worked out more to like 10 acres for every acre that we've developed. And it's now almost 1.5 million acres in the US. I think it's one of the largest private sector-driven conservation programs in the country, maybe the world, I don't know. That's a simple thing. And then we've also been working on our own land to do things like pollinator gardens and retaining ponds, wetland restoration, and so on. So even something as simple as a retail site in a community can have nature restoration aspects to it. So I'll stop there. I'm excited about what's possible. We do need to move a lot quicker. Everybody needs to move a lot quicker. I am, obviously concerned about the resources in a time, given all the stats you just shared, Patricia. But, as Piyush said, sometimes in crisis, there's opportunity for radical solutions, and that's certainly what we need.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, and I absolutely coincide with you. And these are the times to be bold, and I loved your phrase of rewiring the way that we are working. I think that's exactly what we need. So I think this is exactly what you have been talking about, André, is like rethinking our model, rewiring it, as Kathleen put it. You have been such a huge advocate of circular economy. You have been a huge advocate of making sure that out of the ashes of the COVID pandemic, we come up with a model that makes more sense socially and environmentally. Tell us, share your wisdom with us.
Thank you very much. I mean, you do me high praise by telling me that I have wisdom. I'm afraid I was just caught short like everybody else in this crisis. First, I'd like to sort of show a little bit of gratitude to you, Patricia. I mean, BirdLife is an organization. It used to be known as ICBP. My father has been associated with this for generations, for 50, 60 years. I've been able to participate as a founding patron to the creation of BirdLife. This is for me a very, very moving moment because for a long time, I was that sort of improbable participant to two types of seminars. The one done by Nature Conservation Organization, WWF, BirdLife, Wetlands, and then the business side. So for those of you who don't really know my family history, my father was one of the founding members of WWF and a number of other conservation initiatives. I myself participated into as many of those as I was allowed to. And at the same time, my family owns the biggest pharmaceutical business in the world. And I have a lot of time spending in the boardrooms since 24 years of our family company. So making a bridge between these two worlds has always been something that I took very much at heart, and I'm really very excited to see that all this is now coming together. Patricia referred to the fact that we were together at a seminar yesterday. This was my business school in SEAD, talking to people that nature matters. And now suddenly we are a nature conservation organization talking to people that finance matter, that business matters, and that business is part of the solution. I find that really exciting, and this is sort of groundbreaking for me. I just wanted to sort of personalize this a little bit, and if from time to time my voice starts faltering a bit, it's because I'm really very excited to be here today. I just wanted to say that we as humanity have been dealing with nature in a way which is all based on the model of domination. You know, we have invented the Anthropocene. We control everything. We are able to extract all the energy we need from nature. We can distribute it for incredibly efficient methods, and we increase prosperity by developing nature. Well, COVID shows to us that this system, the system that is specializing more and more, is not a system that works. It's unfit for purpose. So in my activities as a conservationist in the past, I have been able to identify a couple of weak points, and we've been trying to bring the agenda into a number of situations where we need to, we were talking about regenerative agriculture before, we need to talk about regeneration, we need to talk about net contribution of business to society. Well, since the COVID came, suddenly all this is taking a real acceleration, and the pressure points have become holes, have become gaps. The whole humanity is unable to function because of the virus. I mean, the virus is the most primitive form of life on Earth. It's probably not even alive if it doesn't have a host. So it's really something extremely instructive, and also should bring us to a certain level of humility. We can propose solutions, and really now it's time to redefine the relationship between humanity and nature. And I think a lot of examples of that are happening. But we also need to do that with a sufficiently humble attitude. We don't have all the solutions. It's a wake-up call, but we have to stay ambitious in our thinking. Ambitious does not mean that we are all powerful, but we can try something. Basically, the trade-off that we used to think is the most important one, in other words, you can either save nature or make money, that trade-off doesn't exist anymore. Today, we must learn to make money while saving nature, while reconstructing nature, while regenerating part of the natural process. Otherwise, we are sitting on a branch that we are sowing down. I mean, we are in a one system, and we need to sort of remember that. So what's happened during COVID? The fact that so many of what is happening just now, the fact that, and Piyush gave us a good example of this, the fact that so much money is being expended by, money that didn't exist a couple of months ago, but that suddenly is available, is starting to flow to protect jobs and to increase the fight against the disease. And the fact that this happens is a wonderful opportunity, because what it has actually, you should never say wonderful when you talk about such a crisis, which has sort of, by the way, Patricia, it's 17 million as of this morning. It's not 16.8 anymore. You know, this is an opportunity to use this money to encourage business to develop different attitudes towards natural resources. So these bailouts, which are being promised by a number of governments and of international organizations like the European Union and others, must be coming with green conditionalities. This is an opportunity to leapfrog our commitments and to go straight into Paris development, Paris agreement very quickly if we focus on climate. But it also might be a way of reversing the terrifying destruction of species and the destruction of biomass that we've been witnessing in the last couple of years. So as we already have said several times today, it's an approach where businesses and governments and regulators have to work together. If you really want to be able to invest in sustainability, you're going to have to come with some practical examples. And I think, as far as I'm concerned, there are two major recovery strategies. First of all, putting money into the system, a stimulus, is not enough. We also need to deal with environmental regulations. And again, the previous speakers have talked about this, and I think Nicole will allude to it a bit later as well. But what strikes me as being important is that the investment that we make into nature, and we'll come back to that a bit later, has to not take only account the natural capital, it also has to go into the social capital. COVID has made much more obvious and much more evident that part of our wealth, part of our prosperity is unequally distributed. Most of the people who are winners of the 2008 recession and the 2020 COVID pandemics are doing so because they're exploiting other members of humanity. So social equality is something we will have to work on proactively, not just to repair, but to improve. And I think that's a very important point. So if you want to have notions of investment, we need to be able to measure what we invest in. And I would propose the notion of natural capital, which alongside social and human capital can be used to measure the impact companies are having. So not just measure success or financial, not just measure success on the basis of financial numbers, but also measure success on the impact having on natural and social systems. And there are a couple of initiatives coming up. I was very interested to hear about the natural measurements that Piyush proposed. We need to find one voice around all this, and we will need to bring that at a global level. The World Economic Forum is pushing an initiative with the fourth biggest accounting houses to try to bring us a metric that we can all understand when we report within our companies. The important thing is not only to report, of course, transparency is important, but it's also a question of making sure that you take the right investment decision with all the tools needed to make that decision. Now, we talk a lot about nature-based solution, and I thought I would sort of touch on two examples which might be of interest. I take a personal interest into wetlands. I think wetlands have a very important role to play in the future water cycle. Water is not a scarce resource. Water is a badly managed resource, but it is, we don't seem to be able as society to organize it to be in the right quantity, at the right quality, at the right time, and in the right place. I mean, to resolve this, it's logistics. Logistics is the sort of thing that we, humanity, are quite good at doing. So there's an opportunity there by restoring networks of wetlands to create benefits to small businesses, but of course to society at large as well. The example I want to give you is flood control in England. I mean, if we have more coastal wetlands, we could compensate for the sea rise and still be able to manage accidental flood events. The same thing with carbon capture for wetlands. If you want to stay in the climate thinking, wetlands are wonderful carbon capture mechanism, in particular coastal wetlands, and I'm thinking very strongly of mangroves in that particular context. I've been asked to sort of say a quick word on circular economy as well. Our family foundation has worked very closely with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation over the last decade to come forward with a circular economy solution to businesses. And I'd like to quote one company, a Dutch furniture manufacturer called Arend, who have developed a model which they call FaaS, Furniture as a Service. In other words, you pay monthly for the use of the furniture, and the day you stop paying, you give the furniture back, and there is no, you get out of this system where you purchase, consume, and throw away, which is a sort of linear system, into a circular system where you rent, you reuse, you redesign, you reuse, and you have this concept. Well, there's much more to be said, but my watch tells me I'm already too long. I'm terribly sorry. I'm very much looking forward to questions, in particular because they come from conservationists, and that's something that I really would like to see better addressed in this conversation. So remember, we don't need to make a trade-off. We can make money and we can increase prosperity without destroying the planet. And if we don't succeed this time, I don't know when we will. I mean, I'm 62 years old. I will never see an opportunity like this again, and we're going to make the most out of this. Thank you.
I agree, and thank you so much. And not only for your passion and your wisdom, you are very wise, but also for all of your support to BirdLife and to the conservation world. You and your family have been a huge force helping us get where we are. So I can't not agree more with you of all of these extraordinary examples, and you and I absolutely love wetlands, so we will keep championing for them. So just last week, very fortunate to us, the World Economic Forum put a report out that came to me as the perfect element to bundle into this webinar. The WEF published The Future of Nature and Business. And I am incredibly fortunate to have secured Nicole in the middle of the summer holidays to be able to come and join this fantastic panel and share with us some of the highlights of the report, but also all of the great plans that the web is having for the Great Reset. So Nicole.
Thank you very much, Patricia. It's a pleasure to be on this webinar. And I think that's also very interesting to hear Piyush, Kathleen, and André, because I think a lot of the things that they said are examples that are highlighted in the report in some of the transitions that are recommended. So maybe just to give you a little bit of context, as I mean, has already been made pretty clear, we have to address the biodiversity crisis and the loss of nature, as well as the climate crisis. I think it's pretty clear that we can't just focus on climate alone. And already last year, the World Economic Forum started to do some research and with the intention to launch this report series called the New Nature Economy Report Series, where the first report, which was launched in January, was looking at, so what is actually the risk to business of nature loss? So can we quantify what that risk represents in terms of material terms to business? And that's the figure that you quoted before. That research showed that 44 trillion, which is 50% of the GDP of value, is at risk because of the dependency of business on nature and on its services, on the ecosystem services. So that was the first report in the series, looking really at what is the risk that we're facing. And I think that in the last 3 months, we have seen what that actually means. I mean, Piyush, you talked about tail risks and kind of, you know, we're thinking about probabilities, but this is no longer a probability. And I think now is really the time to bring this home and to see we must address this right now, because otherwise, you know, we are going to face some major shocks in the future. So the second report in the series was looking at, okay, if this is the risk, what are the opportunities to business? Because as André said, it's not about conservation versus, you know, economic development and jobs and kind of pitting these in opposition as has been in the past, but it's really actually quite the opposite, because nature, the environment, is the foundation of our economy. So how can we, as Kathleen said, completely change our mindset from one that is based on the depletion of the stock of natural capital and the depletion of nature to one that is actually based on regeneration, restoration, which will benefit the economy and societies in the long term. And so again, the research of the forum set out to look at, so first of all, what are the 3 socioeconomic systems? So talking about systems that have the biggest impact on nature loss, but at the same time, where there are the biggest opportunities from transition. And so here, the report focuses on 3 systems. The first system is the food, land, and ocean use. So everything having to do with agriculture, forestry, fisheries, you know, so that, and that is one of the systems, how we call it, more than sectors, because it aggregates different sectors, that has one of the biggest impact on threatened species, on nature loss. The second system is infrastructure and the built environment, and the third, energy and extractives. And I'll say a little bit more about the 3. And together, they are driving 80% of the threat to. Here we took kind of as an indicator, because as some of you have said, you know, what indicators do we use to measure nature loss and biodiversity impact? And here we looked at threatened and near threatened species as kind of an indicator of the impact on nature loss. So together, these systems represent 1/3 of the global economy and provide 2/3 of all the jobs. So this is what we're looking at. And then within that, the opportunity that was identified is that if we shift it towards what we call a nature positive economy. So again, shifting from depletion of natural capital to actually regeneration and nature positive economy, not only could this trend generate $10 trillion annually in business value, but could also create 395 million jobs over the next decade. So a huge opportunity in this transition from where we are today to a nature positive economy. So what we looked at is in each of these systems, so what is the current situation and what do these transitions mean? So I'm just going to say a little bit more about that, because otherwise it can seem quite abstract. So if we take just, for example, the food, land, and ocean use, and some of you have already talked about that, but because it's such an important one, currently this is 40% of employment. It's responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, 70% of freshwater use, and 80% of tropical deforestation and habitat loss. If we shift that and we switch to a combination, I mean, these systemic transitions that we've identified, to a combination of ecosystem restoration, so conservation, restoration, avoided land and ocean use expansion. Second, productive and regenerative agriculture, so a combination of technology, traditional knowledge to reduce chemicals, more precision in water, et cetera, et cetera. Third, in the ocean, very similarly, sustainable management, healthy and productive oceans. Fourth, sustainable management of forests. 5, planet-compatible consumption, which touches both upon diets. So can we switch the diets from more meat-intensive, which we know has a huge footprint, to other types of protein, but not just the diets. Planet-compatible consumption also looks at textiles, right, and the whole fashion industry. And so this touches upon the circular economy models, André, that you mentioned. And then finally, transparent and sustainable supply chains. So all of this together in this sector alone could create 191 million new jobs and generate 3.6 trillion of additional revenue. And so similarly, I mean, I'm not going to, there's a lot of data and there's a lot of content in the report, but I just want to kind of give you a perspective of what this means. Similarly, in each of the other sectors, like infrastructure and the built environment, here, what types of transitions are we talking about? We know that just every week, because of the growth right now in urbanization, around 1.5 million people will be added to cities if we continue at the same rate over the next decade. So that is huge, and the needs for infrastructure are going to be huge. So how do we transition here as well? And the transitions that are laid out by the report include, things like looking at utilities, how to make them more efficient, more planet compatible, looking at nature as infrastructure, looking at also the design and how to have more compact urban spaces. So again, here, how can we maximize, take inefficiencies out of the system and capture some of those opportunities? And finally, energy and extractives. I just want to, here we're looking also at, circular and more resource efficient models of production. So we have to extract less resources in the first place. And then in those cases where that is not possible, what is the nature positive components of some of these industries? So I'll stop here. There's, of course, a lot more that can be said, but I think this gives a picture. And what I want to add now is that this is really kind of the angle for business, right? So depending on each sector, there are opportunities that can be captured, but this cannot just be driven by business alone. And we're talking right now about, post-COVID recovery, and this transition laid out in the report is estimated that it will require 2.7 trillion of investment annually, which seems a lot, but if you compare it, for example, to the US stimulus package that was announced in March, was 2.2 trillion, right? So again, like we can look at these figures and see actually we can mobilize that investment if we really see the opportunities and understand that this is the pathway that will unlock jobs and revenue in the end. And then finally, policy, just one more word on policy. So the report has a policy companion to it, looking at what are the enablers to make these transitions happen. And some of it was already mentioned by you, Patricia, in the beginning, but how do we measure the right things, and by Piyush, right? So natural capital, how can we start to properly measure natural capital? Over the past 20 years, natural capital declined in value by 40%. How is that good management, right? So how can we start to integrate this in our systems and in our metrics? And then other things that were also mentioned are, investing in human capital and kind of training and skills that will be required for these new jobs, for these transitions, enabling innovation, and also very specifically spatial planning, especially when we're looking at the ecosystem restoration, conservation. And Kathleen, you gave us an example of how that could happen in terms of jurisdictional approaches within what Walmart is doing. So I think I'll stop here and leave the rest for questions. And there's a lot more detail for those who are interested to dig deeper in the reports.
Yeah, and I will put in a minute the link to the report on the chat room for those of you who have not seen it. I have to say, I read it over the weekend and it is phenomenal. There's so much that we should be harvesting from. So thank you so much to you and the team of the WEF for putting that out. Okay, we have a series of questions from the floor. Let me start with something that a couple of people have mentioned. We have been talking about policies and the need of policies and regulation there in order to drive private sector. However, we don't always see the commitment of the governments, number one, but also we would like to know why is this interesting to the private sector? If the public sector is not coming with the right policies, is it not going to happen? Or is there already an interest from the private sector? So both the dependence that we have for a transition with strong policies and regulations, but also the interest of the private sector to go forward for a greener future, regardless of the policy framework. So can I start with you, Nicole, because the policy companion is very clear about that.
Yes, I think there is a very clear role for the public sector to drive these transitions, but I do think this is really, and you asked initially about what are the challenges. I think one of the challenges here is that this is the responsibility, it's a kind of a joint responsibility of all actors having to step up to this, and each actor can take leadership in different areas. And in the context of the green recovery packages that we're talking about, I think there is a very clear responsibility for governments to start to shift policies towards this nature positive pathway, which is a good risk management strategy, because actually if we don't do so, then we are increasing the probability of more risks coming towards us. So this is really fundamental, and I mentioned some of them already, kind of measuring the right things, but one I didn't mention, but it was mentioned before, which is fundamental, and that is where some of the difficult conversations and some of, I would say, where we need political leadership is fixing incentives. I mean, you mentioned it at the beginning, Patricia, how many billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of subsidies, whether it's in agriculture or in fisheries or, I don't want to enter into the climate area, but that are directed at harmful practices. And I think it's really time for leadership on this and to say this has to stop, and we need to transition, and we need to transition this towards nature positive regenerative practices and accompany that with the packages that will make it possible also. I mean, we talked about, just transitions and capacity building and investment in human capital. So I think we need strong leadership. And as André said, it's now that we need that from the public sector as well.
Absolutely. So
if I can come in on that one. So I think, for private sector companies to act, you need one of 3 or 4 catalysts. The first is leadership, boards and management find religion. So there's a values and ethics-based commitment for a new world. And while you will see more of that than you've seen in the past, I'm not holding my breath that you're going to see overnight everybody, come home to God. I think a second driver of this is expectations. So you see expectations from the investor universe, expectations from civil society, and so on. If you can get more and more carbon conscious and nature conscious societies, and more expectations from public, and that's happening, the millennials, the investor base, and so on, I think that's a more a convincing driver of change in the private sector. But finally, the biggest reason for change in the private sector is always, you've got to do what André says. You've got to figure how you can make money while protecting nature. If there's a trade-off between making money and protecting nature, you'll always find it hard to get everybody to come seriously and meaningfully to the party. Now, for that to happen, you really need a large public sector agenda. You need a public policy agenda. You need to measure it right. You need to make sure that the bad subsidies are out of the system. All of those things need to come together to make sure that you actually get the economics right. And that's why you need public policy partnership with the private sector if you're really going to see a significant and step change.
Great, thank you. So it's clear that we have to work together, right? And public-private partnerships is probably one of the ways forward. Kathleen, I loved your example of Saba, and I'm wondering what is your thinking about scaling that up? We need more of this in more places. We need more of these relationships where civil society working hand in hand with government and supporting private sector so we can all crack it. But how do we move from the pilots in Saba or you know, different little places here and there into a global movement?
Well, so I'd like to start by talking about the economic benefits or business benefits of investing in nature. And there are a number of reasons that we see suppliers moving in this direction, that we're focused on this just purely from a business perspective. So one, of course, is surety of supply. So resilience of the supply chain and having a reliable source of a commodity in the future at the right quality level and so on. There are often economic benefits as well. So as you improve yields in a place, that's good for cost structure, right? And just sheer volumes. There are also quality benefits and so on. And then of course, as Piyush was just saying, more and more customers are becoming aware of environmental and social issues and demand that, which is a great thing to have in terms of demand signal for business. And that also just helps with even things like general reputational benefit from investing in initiatives like this. So the direction of travel is absolutely toward financial value creation, reputational benefit, customer trust, and so on. And then not to mention, increasingly, even in the investor community, if you consider the capital at work for companies that can demonstrate positive impact on environmental and social as well as governance outcomes. So I think we'll see more and more incentives moving in a positive direction for protecting nature. Specifically in ground level landscape projects, you know, what do we need to do to scale that? This is where I'm talking about transformation, because it's not the norm. You know, the kind of projects that I just mentioned, those are just starting. So how do we scale? So one way that we're trying to do that is through our initiatives that do cross categories, that cross suppliers. So this Project Gigaton platform that I mentioned is a way to exchange best practices, inspire and inform many more companies about what's possible, get them to engage in their own supply chains and begin to expand. Another is through consortia like One Planet Business for Biodiversity that are attempting to create larger scale public-private partnerships that could be open to anyone to join. So I think that kind of mechanism is also helpful. I would say one of the biggest challenges is at the local government level, local and national government level, because without that government support and engagement, many of these types of projects are very difficult to get off the ground, let alone scale. And so that is something that I'm hoping as the average citizen becomes more aware of this challenge and the electorate in different places becomes more informed, we'll start to see political leaders also becoming engaged, just, you know, based on the demands and interests of the people. That's the one I'm worried the most about, because that process typically, it can be slow. And we really need that to be able to make a lot of progress at scale.
Great, thank you. André, can I come to you, because you have been a huge advocate of making us work together with business. How do you see the future of public-private partnership, and how can we make them, in Kathleen's examples of both the Danone One Planet case is a great one, but how can we do more of that?
So, thank you. Emmanuel Faber is a good friend. We are both part of the B team, and we've at numerous occasions spoke about how you can service the big distribution chains in a better, efficient way by talking about natural capital. But for me, there's we are going to require a significant change of paradigm. And I know it's a bit of a cliched sentence which has been used far too often. But as long as we measure the success of businesses only based on short-term financial returns, we are not going to take the right decisions. So we do need metrics. We need to take into account the externalities of the value creation process as we practice it now. If we want to invest into a situation, we need a toolbox which will tell us how we allocate our assets in the most efficient manner, not only financially, not only short term, but also for the long-term cost to society as a whole. And so the impact measurement I was talking earlier on about is something that we really need to make sure we agree on. And this is, for me, the biggest role of the regulators. If we are, of the government in general, if we do agree on the level playing field, we should be able to create a system that will be mutually beneficial. You know, it took about 450 years to develop accounting rules that are accepted by all. And we still, you know, trick them from time to time. We still use them to our benefit. I hope it's not going to take us that long to get some impact measurement, but we do need to find a way of taking nature and turning into an asset class and turning it into something that is in the balance sheet and whose utilization, or which utilization, sorry, will be reflected in a profit and loss account. As long as we only rely on contemporary financial accounting, we will not get there. So for me, the start is there. Let's measure. We will manage well what we can measure, but if we cannot measure it, or at least if we can interpret it too much, then that's going to be a problem.
I agree, and internalizing externalities is going to be a huge element of that valuation and measurement. So let's assume for a second that we actually managed to get the governments in to push for the right policies, and that we are taking advantage of that from the private sector. Piyush, you mentioned the role of the younger generation, and Kathleen, you mentioned during your initial presentation the role of individuals and how we as an individual have to be changing, or we have to make changes at the individual level to start compounding up and making an impact at the global level. How do we change? There's a question on the board about how do we change this mentality about us looking for the human benefit only versus having a human with nature, or human being part of nature benefit mentality. From the private sector perspective, how do you see that? Piyush, you want to comment? You're muted.
You're muted.
It's a tough question because, you know, you're talking about how do you change attitudes and behaviors of people, and I want to take a stab at it in a very different way. You know, there's a philosopher scientist called Albert Hoffmann from Netherlands in the 1970s. He wrote a book which is one of my favorite books called The Passions and the Interests. And the sum thesis of the book is that till the 16th or 17th century, the organizing principle of society, what people valued was conquest and valor. So the knight and the warrior was far more appreciated than the merchant or the capitalist in most societies. Over time, it took 200 years for society to change that organizing principle from conquest and valor to a market-based economy and capitalism. So it was a bunch of philosophers, but included the Adam Smiths of the world, with the recognition that the sin of avarice or the sin of greed is better than the sin of conquest or lust or valor. Now you're asking me, how do you change this recognition that the sin of greed might have gone too far? And how do you chain back and pull back the sin of greed and bring the pendulum center? And frankly, I'm not smart enough to know the answer to that. One thing I do believe, which is why we're trying to do that, is the more you make people aware of the consequences, the more likely you are to get action. And that's why in my comments I said disclosure and measurement is really important. So one thing we're trying to do is to create a carbon calculator, which we're going to create for every citizen in Singapore, which means based on your bank spending, your credit card spending, we're tying up with the power company if we can, a utility bill, we give you a carbon score. And if it comes in front of you every month saying, hey, this is your carbon score, and you know, that's not a good thing. And by the way, if you were able to plant a tree, you'd get some offset. It is my hope that the constant reminder, measurement, and focus starts shifting people's behavior and attitude. So that's one. The other is a little bit optimistic. I just think the younger generation, the Greta Thunberg generation, is just more naturally engaged and involved with recognizing that it's not just about the short-term economics and value. So I have to say, when I grew up in the 1960s, the hippie movement was very similar. But all of the people, by the time they got to their 30s and 40s, suddenly became capitalists. So I can't say for sure. where the young people stay that way in the long term. But I do think measurement and constant reminder is a large part of getting people to focus on the right stuff.
Thank you, Piyush. Nicole, what do you think?
Yes, I'd like to add something to that. I think celebrating positive examples is really important, because the other thing is I also feel, you know, with so much doom and gloom and so many bad news, which are important because part of it is about not being in denial about what's really happening, but the risk is that then it becomes overwhelming. And so when we're talking about behavior change, how can we have positive examples and inspiration and pathways that show that it is possible, because it really is about a very deep change in kind of the fundamentals of how the system has been operating, by using these opportunities, by showing that, you know, there are different pathways. But I think leading by example, and even if it's just a small group, I mean, we were talking about, you know, the role of business, even if it's just a smaller group of companies who are taking that leadership and showing positive examples of what can actually be done in a different way and with these partnerships, that to me is a fundamental component of this transition. And then finally, I also think, I mean, we're working very much with youth movements now as part of the Nature-Based Solutions Platform and the Trillion Trees Project particularly, and really unleashing this restoration generation, you know, and how can you become an ecopreneur? And so that you're actually, as part of being an entrepreneur, you already have that mindset of restoration and regeneration embedded. So yes, so I think it requires a lot of things, what Piyush said, but then can we show examples? Can we celebrate them? And then can we encourage others to follow, and then build the skills and the tools for young people to become entrepreneurs, but in a very different way, and using, you know, ecopreneurship as a basis.
Super, thank you. So let's talk about jobs. Jobs are going to be the crucial measure of how we get out of this crisis. How do we reignite not only the economy, but how do we make sure that we create the jobs that have been lost? On one of my slides, I was showing the absolute shocking measure of the ILO, with 400 million full-time jobs lost in the second quarter of the year. And, you know, numbers from people like Forbes coming and saying 42% of those jobs losses may be permanent. And at the same time, we are proposing these transformations that Nicole, you said, on just the transformation of the food and oceans system may generate 191 million new jobs. So one of the things that we were discussing in one of the other webinars was precisely the opportunity of restoring, because I think we have to look into forgetting about nature neutral and go into the nature positive, and remember that we have to start restoring a lot of what we have damaged. And those are jobs. I mean, I keep thinking that those are extraordinary opportunities of generating jobs. But there's not a lot of conversation about ecosystem restoration and as an opportunity for jobs. So where are we on this? Do we see, I'm gonna go to all of you because I think this is an incredibly important element. So when we're thinking about new jobs, Kathleen, from the retail sector, where do you think those are going to be? And can we actually push for green jobs that are actually going to help us restore nature?
So, you know, when you consider technology in general, not just the pandemic, but technology evolution and the impact on jobs, the estimates that we've seen are from places like McKinsey & Company, where there's an estimate that 2/3 of the jobs that are done today will have at least 1/3 of the tasks involved in those jobs enabled by technology. Those tasks will actually go away. And so the question becomes not so much the loss of an entire job, but the massive upheaval and transformation of individual jobs, and probably the combination of tasks into new jobs that people didn't expect, and so on. And that's certainly what we're seeing in the retail sector. So if I just talk about our own operations, we have jobs that we couldn't have even imagined 10 years ago. So for example, personal shopper. Now we have a way for customers to do their grocery shopping all online. They place their order and they literally just drive up to the store and somebody comes out with all the groceries already chosen for them. So that person who is now shopping for the customer that's a new role that we didn't have before. At our front end in the checkout, we have a lot more self-checkout machines, so fewer cashiers, but many of the people who used to do the cashier role, where a lot of that job was literally taking an item and scanning it across the counter, that task may have gone away, but we still need that human interaction with the customer. So now we have a host job, and we have more people on the floor helping folks find things and so on. So we're certainly seeing that transformation in our own business.
Thank you. André, can I come to you? You're muted.
Yeah, no, of course, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, I am on mute. I'm sorry, that's not. I think that the nature of jobs are changing. New technology are securing this. We need to make sure that we give people more content and that we give them an opportunity to participate. To the purpose of the company. All this is wonderful conversation 6 months ago. Now we're in an emergency situation. We need to get jobs off the ground quickly. And green infrastructure offers all this. The retrofitting of existing building into well-insulated homes, the establishment of solar captors. I mean, all these investments which are going to happen anyway because we need to continue to heat our homes. And I mean, maybe in Singapore you need to do the opposite. But anyway, we need to insulate the houses. We also need to make sure that we have an enormous amount of cheap and renewable energy if you really want to transition into this new, more specialist phase. So I believe that green infrastructure play is one of the important part of this public-private partnership you were talking about before. Let's give incentive for this sort of work to happen. And these are, I think, quality jobs. Without wanting to rubbish other people in business in general, everybody makes a lot of song and dance about the fact that during that crisis, Amazon has created tens of thousands of jobs. Well, these are zero-hour employment jobs with no security whatsoever. I don't call that jobs. I call that sort of, short-term, they're poor quality jobs, basically. And why? Because only the financial consideration has been taken into account. If the impact of these jobs would be taken, you would not create an underclass of employees like this, because you know that this is something that's going to come and bite you. People who are taking these decisions are not bad people. They're just people who are misguided because our current system puts more emphasis on short-term profit maximization than it does on the holistic approach. And that we need to change. And yes, new technology will probably make it easier. It will disrupt the way we think about these things.
Thank you. Piyush.
So, Patricia, I think there are two things. One is, if you take systemic solutions, for example, I talked about the Emerging Stronger Task Force in Singapore, and we're trying to drive systemic solutions for change. You can get jobs out of those. There's 7 or 8 things we're trying to drive, which is includes digital distribution of education, e-healthcare, traceability in supply chains, etc. But even in the sustainability of the green agenda, if we can actually get a verification and rating system going, if we can get a marketplace going, if we can get a capacity to work with Indonesia and Vietnam on creating the projects we talked about before, Kathleen talked about some going, you can actually build a lot of jobs. We anticipated, we estimated almost 10,000 jobs in Singapore just based on some of the initiatives that we have identified. But the bigger answer to your question, Patricia, I'm of the view that because of the phenomena Kathleen referred to, not just jobs are going, but activities within jobs are going. I think we have to be reconciled to a world where you will find fewer jobs. The answer to that, however, is I think in greater entrepreneurship. I think one of the things we've got to recognize that the large corporation that we know today is only an artifact of the Industrial Revolution. It was Henry Ford's assembly line, along with Max Weber's bureaucracy. We created large companies to get scale economies. Today, technology allows you to access a global market and operate in a global space without actually having a large company. So I think the opportunity to create a lot more small enterprises, small set entrepreneurships, working from your garage is the proverbial thing, is I think the way of the future. So how do you create the capacity to take risks, to use data and information and use technology in a meaningful way as you rebuild the food systems, the water systems, the agriculture systems? I think that's what we need to try and solve for.
Right.
And I would just add to that, Patricia, that, you know, in any transformation throughout human history, jobs will change for sure. But there's no shortage of problems to solve. So even though, yes, certain tasks are automatable and so on, certain tasks may not need to be done anymore, people will find a way to solve problems and to create jobs that are useful in that context. So I think it's hard for us to predict now exactly what those will be, but humans tend to do that.
Yeah.
Can I quickly add something about this notion of new technologies allowing us to get closer to what the issue actually is? I have this vision of a new age where workers will be able to actually do the job they want to do because we will know them better and we will know better what the needs of the companies are. I see that happening already very clearly in the health sector. You know, in the good old days, we used to have one pill that would cure everything. That is finished. Our technologies allow us to go to personalized healthcare. And personalized healthcare is not only giving, you know, the right drugs at the right time, it's also understanding the patient and making sure that the patient gets assistance both mentally and in terms of therapy. So I have a lot of hope for this notion of tailoring solutions to the exact situation. And it's a bit contradictory to say that you're going to have more jobs which are going to be more personal. But if we continue to consider employees just as factors of production, we will never be able to create the purpose that will allow us to go forward. So I think that's something we should be including in our conversations as well.
I agree completely. All right, Nicole.
Very briefly, I just want to add that if we look at the renewable energy sector, I think that's a good illustration of how suddenly all these new jobs were created and new opportunities in a space that previously didn't exist. And I think the same is going to happen here in this space of creating nature positive economies. We're seeing examples already, new businesses, and I think entrepreneurship is key on one hand. And then we're also seeing how governments in the short term are using some of the stimulus packages to create jobs for, you know, restoration of wetlands in New Zealand or in Pakistan to establish new national parks. So I think these are also very interesting examples of more in the immediate term stimulation of jobs with a direct impact on the restoration of nature.
I agree. And I think we have to keep thinking about restoring ecosystems, not only forests and wetlands, but, you know, grasslands and all the types of ecosystems that we have been destroying all along. It's one of the key elements of making sure that we have a green recovery. We have run out of time. Actually, we are over time, but I could be talking to you guys all day. It's been a phenomenal experience. Thank you so much for all of your fantastic examples, your experience, your passion, your conviction. I think we need more of this everywhere. And I would like to thank all of the people who sign up for this webinar. For those of you who want to share it, we will have the video up in a couple of days in our YouTube channel, and I think Sean has put it on the chat room. Also, don't forget to support our campaign. We do need to have the right to a healthy environment as a human right. It is only fair. And it is the perfect umbrella and the guidance for all of the green recovery that we're trying to have. With that, thank you, Piyush, thank you, André, thank you, Nicole, thank you, Kathleen. It's been lovely to talk to you guys. We'll be in touch soon. And for those of you in the audience, don't forget that in August, hopefully the 3rd or 4th week of August, we will have a group of youth leaders talking and I'm sure demanding a green recovery. So stay tuned. We will be sending invitations soon, and we will. And I want to thank you again for your time, all of you, and to the panelists for your fantastic experiences. Thanks for joining us.